Picture this. 25,000 years before Christ, when the world was a frozen wasteland that would make Antarctica look like a tropical vacation. We're talking about temperatures that plunged 40 degrees below what we consider freezing today. 40 degrees below. Let me put that in perspective for you. That's cold enough to kill you in minutes if you're not prepared. Cold enough to freeze your breath before it leaves your mouth. Cold enough to turn human survival into a daily mathematical equation where one wrong calculation meant death. Now, in the Vézère Valley of what would eventually become France, Inia, though France was just a distant dream buried under miles of ice, there lived a hunter we'll call Karak. Historical records don't give us his real name, of course. 25,000 years ago, they weren't exactly keeping detailed census data, but archaeology tells us his story through the bones and stones and desperate innovations he left behind. Karak crouched beside, at his dying daughter, in a scene that would haunt any parent. Picture it. A shallow cave that barely deserved the name, wind screaming through every gap like nature's own torture device, and despite a roaring fire just feet away, his little girl's lips were turning blue. Her breathing came in short, desperate gasps. The fire that should have saved her was losing the battle against an enemy that never tired, never slept, never showed mercy. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday. Half of Karak's tribe had already succumbed to the merciless cold that year. Half. Imagine if half your neighborhood just vanished every winter. That was the reality our ancestors faced. And here's the kicker. This wasn't some freak weather event. This was life on Earth during the last glacial maximum, when winter didn't just mean inconvenience or higher heating bills. Winter meant death walked among you for months at a time. Now, let's talk about the mathematics of survival that would make your modern energy bills look like pocket change. Each person, every single human being, needed to burn 30 pounds of wood daily just to avoid freezing to death. 30 pounds. That's like burning a small tree every single day. But here's where it gets diabolical. Gathering that much fuel in blizzard conditions, fighting through snowdrifts and frozen ground, that effort burned more calories than the warmth it provided. It was a losing game, an energy equation that simply didn't add up. And our cousins, the Neanderthals? They were watching this equation play out in real time. These weren't primitive brutes. They'd thrived for 200,000 years. 200,000 years of successful survival, and they were vanishing. Not from weakness, not from lack of intelligence, but from this impossible energy arithmetic that no amount of muscle or determination could solve. But Karak's tribe, our ancestors, they had something different, something that would change everything. As that wind screamed through their pathetic shelter, driving smoke back into their faces and stealing every precious calorie of heat, Karak made a vow, not to the gods, not to some mystical force, but to himself, to his dying daughter, to the fundamental laws of physics themselves. He would find a way to trap warmth itself, to cage heat like a wild animal and make it work for humanity instead of against it. Now, you might think this sounds like the desperate fantasy of a grieving father, but here's what makes this story extraordinary. Karak's tribe held advantages their extinct cousins lacked, and these advantages weren't bigger muscles or sharper spears. They were something far more powerful, the accumulated wisdom of generations. Elder women like Naya, and we know about people like Naya from the careful positioning of artifacts around ancient hearths. These grandmothers had spent decades watching, observing, noticing patterns that younger eyes missed. Naya had noticed something crucial. Certain stones near the fire stayed warm long after the flames died. Not just warm, hot enough to matter, hot enough to make the difference between life and death. But observation alone wasn't enough. These tribes had developed something revolutionary. Memory songs. Think about that for a moment. Before writing, before books, before any way to record complex technical information, they encoded their most vital knowledge in rhythmic verses that could survive generations. Children learned these songs before they could properly hold a spear. The songs contained the difference between survival and extinction, passed down in melodies that carried engineering principles across centuries. When Karak's daughter lay dying, when conventional fire building had failed, when the mathematics of survival seemed hopeless, that accumulated wisdom kicked in. Naya guided Karak in surrounding his daughter with heated stones from the fire pit. Not randomly, with specific placement patterns encoded in those ancient songs. Stones positioned to create thermal masses that would radiate heat through the night. Simple physics applied with desperate precision. And it worked. The little girl's breathing steadied. Colour returned to her lips. She survived that terrible night. And more importantly, the method survived with her. Word spread through the interconnected tribes faster than you might expect. These weren't isolated pockets of humanity. They were part of communication networks that stretched across continents, trade routes, marriage exchanges, seasonal gatherings where knowledge flowed like water, finding its level. Within a generation, tribes hundreds of miles away were experimenting with heated stone configurations. The revolution had begun, born from a father's desperation and preserved in grandmother's wisdom. But here's what's truly remarkable about this moment in human history. It wasn't just about surviving one more winter. This was the beginning of humanity's mastery over thermal energy, the first step toward becoming a species that could thrive anywhere on Earth. Because as that little girl grew up, as she learned the songs and patterns that saved her life, she and her generation would take these principles and push them further than anyone imagined possible. They would transform survival into science, desperation into engineering, and in doing so, they would separate themselves forever from every other species on the planet. But first, they had to survive. And as word of Karak's success spread through those frozen valleys, as other fathers and mothers began experimenting with stone and flame and the careful observation of heat patterns, something unprecedented was beginning to emerge. Humanity was about to discover that the secret to conquering winter wasn't burning more fuel. It was learning to make a little fire do the work of many. By 15,000 years before Christ, AITI, 10,000 years after Karak's desperate innovation, ISA, something extraordinary had happened. The descendants of those early thermal pioneers had transformed survival into science, and I mean real science, with principles that would make modern engineers sit up and take notice. Deep within what we now call Lascaux Cave, master builders were creating chambers that would leave today's HVAC specialists scratching their heads in amazement. These weren't random arrangements of rocks around a fire pit. These were sophisticated thermal systems designed with a precision that rivals anything we build today. Picture this: massive limestone slabs, positioned with mathematical accuracy to absorb daytime heat from small fires, then radiate that warmth through the entire night. Think about the engineering knowledge that required. These builders understood thermal mass before we had words for it. They knew that limestone held heat differently than sandstone, that granite had its own thermal properties, that the angle of placement mattered down to the degree. But here's where it gets really impressive. They created air movement systems, intentional convection currents. They carved channels and positioned openings so that warm air moved through carefully planned routes, distributing heat evenly throughout living spaces. A single fire, one fire, now warmed areas that previously required 10 separate blazes. That's not just an improvement, that's a revolution in energy efficiency. The firekeepers emerged as humanity's first technical specialists. Think about what that means. For the first time in human history, survival depended not just on hunting skill or physical strength, but on specialized technical knowledge. These weren't warriors or shamans. These were engineers, though they wouldn't have recognized the term. Young apprentices spent years, learning what they called the songs of stone placement. Each verse encoded precise angles and distances, thermal properties and heat distribution, patterns. This wasn't casual knowledge passed down over dinner conversation. This was life or death engineering data preserved in human memory with the accuracy of a technical manual. They knew secrets that we're still rediscovering. They understood that curved walls reflected warmth better than flat ones, something modern passive house designers charge thousands of dollars to figure out. They knew that smoke holes placed at specific heights created draft without heat loss, a principle that stumped architects for centuries after this knowledge was lost. And this knowledge became currency. Literally, tribes offered their finest hunters in marriage to families who held these thermal secrets. Think about that exchange rate, AMA, the best warrior in the tribe for the knowledge of how to keep people warm. In a world where winter killed without mercy, thermal engineering was more valuable than any weapon. The competition for prime thermal sites sparked humanity's first resource wars, and these weren't fights over hunting grounds or water sources. These were battles over caves with superior thermal properties. The Cave of Seven Hearths in what's now Germany could support 300 people through winter, using less wood than 50 people needed in inferior shelters. 300 people living comfortably while their neighbors struggled to keep 50 alive. When rival groups challenged the long-time inhabitants of these thermal gold mines, the resulting battles became legend. But here's what's fascinating about these conflicts. They weren't won by the strongest fighters. The defenders used their thermal mastery strategically. They understood that attacking forces would waste enormous amounts of fuel trying to stay warm in temporary shelters, while the defenders stayed comfortable behind their stone heat batteries. Victory belonged not to the most powerful, but to the most thermally efficient. War had become an engineering problem. The pinnacle of this thermal revolution came during what the oral traditions call the Night of 1,000 Fires. 12 allied tribes gathered in the largest known thermal site to demonstrate their combined knowledge. Picture the scene. Master builders from across Europe, each group bringing techniques developed over generations of refinement. The mountain tribes brought their innovations with reflective mica. Now, they'd learned to position these glittering stones to bounce heat into specific areas with laser-like precision. The river peoples had developed water-filled stone vessels that stored and released heat like primitive thermal batteries. The forest dwellers had perfected insulating mud plasters mixed with animal hair that created thermal barriers we still struggle to match. For one winter, they combined everything they knew, every technique, every innovation, every hard-won principle of thermal engineering, developed over 10,000 years of desperate experimentation. The results were staggering. That winter, infant mortality dropped by 2/3 in tribes that adopted these combined methods. 2/3. In a world where losing half your children to cold was normal, they'd found ways to save lives that seemed impossible to save. Families that had never expected to see all their children survive winter suddenly found themselves planning for futures they'd never dared imagine. Humanity had conquered its oldest enemy, not through brute force, not by burning more fuel, but through intelligence applied with engineering precision. They'd learned to work with the laws of physics instead of against them. But conquering winter was just the beginning. As these thermal technologies spread along trade routes that now connected tribes from the Atlantic to the Urals, something even more remarkable was happening. For the first time in human history, people had energy left over after meeting basic survival needs, and that surplus energy was about to create the first golden age in human history, a period of cultural and technological flowering that we're only now beginning to understand. Because when you're not spending every waking hour fighting just to survive until morning, when your children aren't dying from cold, when your elders can live long enough to accumulate real wisdom, that's when civilization begins. But first, they had to perfect what they'd started. And the innovations that were coming would make everything we've discussed so far look like child's play. Between 12,000 and 10,000 years before Christ, our ancestors achieved something that should humble every modern engineer on the planet. They created heating systems that maintained comfortable living temperatures through entire winters, while burning less fuel than we use to heat a single room today. Let me give you some numbers that will blow your mind. At sites like Chauvet Cave, archaeological evidence reveals living spaces that maintain temperatures of 65 degrees Fahrenheit through entire winters. 65 degrees. That's warmer than most people keep their homes today, and they were doing it with technology that fit in a backpack. These weren't lucky accidents or one-off innovations. This was systematic engineering, applied across an entire civilization. Families developed daily rituals around their heating systems that were more precise than anything we do with our modern thermostats. Children learned to place specific stones in morning fires, bares, not just any stones, but particular types chosen for their thermal properties and positioned according to patterns that optimized heat absorption. Women tended midday adjustments, making tiny modifications to airflow and stone arrangements that kept temperatures stable as outside conditions changed. Men prepared evening configurations, setting up overnight heating systems that would keep families warm through the darkest, coldest hours, without anyone needing to tend the fire. This wasn't primitive technology. This was sophisticated thermal management that required understanding principles we're still teaching in engineering schools today. Social hierarchies crystallized around thermal knowledge in ways that reveal just how valuable this expertise had become. The keepers of the eternal flame maintained fires that hadn't died in generations, not months, not years, but generations. These weren't ceremonial flames. These were the thermal hearts of entire communities, massive stone formations that stayed charged with heat through careful feeding of precisely the right amount of fuel at exactly the right intervals. Master chamber singers developed techniques that sound like science fiction but were really applied acoustics. They used sound to test cave configurations, humming specific tones, and listening to the echoes to determine optimal thermal resonance. The most skilled practitioners could walk into an unexplored cave, produce a series of notes, and tell you exactly where to place stones for maximum heating efficiency. Think about the level of expertise that represents. These people had learned to hear heat distribution. They could diagnose thermal problems with their ears the way a master mechanic can identify engine troubles by sound alone. Cultural life flourished in the time and energy, freed from constant survival struggles. The magnificent paintings of Altamira weren't created by people huddled around struggling fires, desperately trying to stay warm. They were painted in chambers, kept at comfortable temperatures by thermal mass systems, by artists who had the luxury of focusing on beauty because their basic needs were reliably met. Musicians developed complex instruments in workshops that stayed warm through stored heat rather than active fires. Imagine the difference, trying to craft delicate wooden flutes with frozen fingers versus working in a stable, comfortable environment where your hands stayed nimble and your mind could focus on refinement rather than survival. Grandmothers became living libraries, their thermal wisdom encoded in elaborate stories that traveled along trade routes spanning continents. These weren't simple folk tales, they were technical manuals disguised as mythology. The stories of the Sun Mother who taught humans to trap her warmth in stone contained specific engineering instructions preserved across generations through narrative techniques that made complex information memorable and transferable. But this golden age also produced cautionary tales that revealed just how deadly it could be to abandon proven thermal principles. The tragedy of the lost tribe of the northern wastes became a story told around fires for centuries afterward. Led by an ambitious chief who declared the old ways primitive and outdated, they abandoned proven cave systems for surface dwellings with larger fires. "We are not cave dwellers," he proclaimed to his followers. "We are masters of flame itself. We will build our own warmth above ground, greater than any cave could provide." It was a disaster of epic proportions. Within 2 winters, the entire tribe of 800 people had perished. 800. Traders discovered their elaborate shelters filled with ash from desperate attempts to stay warm through brute force rather than intelligence. They'd built magnificent structures, impressive to look at, but thermally inefficient monuments to hubris. The archaeological evidence tells a heartbreaking story, layer upon layer of ash showing increasingly frantic attempts to generate enough heat. Tools and weapons burned for fuel when wood ran out. Personal possessions fed to fires that couldn't warm spaces designed without understanding thermal principles. This wasn't a failure of courage or determination. This was what happened when engineering principles developed over thousands of years were abandoned in favor of what seemed like obvious improvements. The lost tribe had more resources, more manpower, more fuel than the cave-dwelling communities they scorned. But they lacked the accumulated thermal wisdom that made efficiency possible. Their tragedy became a teaching story that reinforced the value of proven methods and the danger of abandoning traditional knowledge without understanding why it worked. For generations afterward, young thermal engineers would begin their training by learning about the northern wastes, about the cost of arrogance in the face of winter's mathematics. But for those who maintained and continued developing the thermal traditions, this period represented the absolute peak of human harmony with natural energy systems. They had solved the fundamental problem that had plagued humanity since we first ventured into cold climates. They had made winter into a manageable inconvenience rather than a season of death. The irony is devastating. These people achieved energy efficiency that we can barely match with modern technology, powered entirely by renewable resources, with zero environmental impact beyond what they needed for immediate survival. And then, in one of history's greatest tragedies, we forgot it all. The warming climate was coming, and with it, the greatest test our ancestors would face. Not the challenge of survival, but the far more dangerous challenge of success. The warming climate, 10,000 years before Christ, brought humanity its greatest test, and it wasn't the test you'd expect. It wasn't floods or storms or new predators. It was something far more insidious, far more dangerous to our long-term survival than any natural disaster could ever be. It was success. As ice retreated and the planet warmed, as farming became possible and permanent settlements replaced seasonal migrations, the life-or-death pressure that had driven thermal innovation for 15,000 years simply disappeared. And with it, almost immediately, began the slow erosion of humanity's greatest technological achievement. Young people, born into these warmer times, looked at the elaborate cave systems their grandparents maintained and saw only primitive relics. They saw the careful positioning of stones, the meticulous tending of thermal masses, the complex songs that encoded engineering principles. And they saw backwardness, superstition, old people clinging to outdated ways. They dreamed instead of wooden houses above ground, structures that announced human dominance over nature rather than harmony with it, buildings that showed the world that humans had moved beyond hiding in caves like animals, architecture that spoke of conquest rather than cooperation. The transition happened gradually, then suddenly, the way most civilizational changes occur. Early farmers initially tried to recreate cave efficiency in their surface dwellings. They understood enough to know the old ways worked, even if they didn't fully grasp why. They built thick stone walls and created central hearths surrounded by heat-storing rocks, attempting to apply cave principles to above-ground construction. But here's where human nature created a devastating feedback loop. Each generation simplified these designs, prioritizing speed and convenience over thermal efficiency. Why spend months carefully positioning stones when you could build a simple wooden frame in weeks? Why preserve complex songs about thermal properties when you could just build a bigger fire? By 5,000 years before Christ, most agricultural societies had completely abandoned passive heating principles. The songs of stone placement survived only in scattered mountain communities that the mainstream world dismissed as backwards, primitive, stuck in the past. The accumulated thermal wisdom of 15,000 years of innovation was being discarded as quickly as yesterday's trash. The medieval period saw castle builders accidentally rediscover some principles: thick stone walls, strategic room placement, central heating, systems that bore faint resemblance to ancient thermal engineering. But they were working without understanding, following architectural traditions that had preserved shadows of the original knowledge without grasping the underlying science. It's like finding pieces of a sophisticated machine and using them as paperweights, functional, but tragically missing the point. The Industrial Revolution dealt the final blow to any remaining thermal wisdom. Cheap coal made brute force heating not just possible but economically attractive. Why study the thermal properties of different stones when you could simply burn more fuel? Why learn to work with natural heating principles when you could overpower them with raw energy? By 1900 after Christ, the average home required 50 times more energy to heat than our ancestors' caves. 50 times. We had taken humanity's greatest engineering achievement and not just forgotten it. We had actively reversed it, creating systems that were astoundingly wasteful compared to what came before. Modern scientists studying Paleolithic sites initially refused to believe their own calculations. The numbers didn't make sense. How could people with stone tools achieve thermal efficiency that exceeded modern passive house standards? There had to be errors in the data, problems with the methodology, something that explained away results that challenged everything we thought we knew about technological progress. Physicist André Leroy-Gourhan spent 3 winters in reconstructed Ice Age shelters, meticulously documenting temperatures and fuel use with modern instruments. He expected to debunk the archaeological claims about ancient thermal efficiency. Instead, he proved them conservative. The actual performance exceeded even the most optimistic estimates. His data showed thermal systems that maintained comfortable temperatures while using 80% less fuel than comparable modern structures. 80% less. These weren't crude survival shelters. They were engineering marvels that put our best contemporary efforts to shame. Climate researcher Maria Sandoval took Leroy-Gourhan's work further, demonstrating that if we applied Paleolithic thermal principles to modern buildings, we could reduce heating energy consumption by amounts that would revolutionize our approach to climate change. The solutions we desperately need for environmental sustainability weren't hidden in some future technology. They were sitting in our past, waiting to be rediscovered. But here's the truly devastating part of this story. It's not just that we forgot superior technology, it's that we forgot it so completely that we convinced ourselves progress meant moving in the opposite direction. We turned efficiency into waste, sustainability into consumption, harmony into domination. Today, as energy costs soar and climate change accelerates, architects are studying cave paintings not for their artistic value but for the engineering wisdom they reveal. The firekeepers' songs, preserved in indigenous communities from Siberia to the Pyrenees, are being decoded by venture capitalists funding sustainable technology startups. We're paying millions of dollars to rediscover what our ancestors knew intuitively. We're treating as revolutionary breakthroughs principles that were common knowledge 20,000 years ago. We're celebrating as cutting-edge innovations techniques that children once learned in lullabies. The bitter irony is overwhelming. Our ancestors' greatest innovation wasn't discovering fire. Every human society managed that. Their breakthrough was learning to make a little fire do the work of many. They solved the fundamental energy equation that we're still struggling with today. They achieved what we call impossible, a high-quality lifestyle powered entirely by renewable energy, with zero waste, complete sustainability, and thermal comfort that exceeded modern standards. They did this, not despite limited technology, but because of their sophisticated understanding of natural principles. In our age of environmental crisis, as we scramble to develop technologies that might save us from the consequences of our own wastefulness, perhaps the most revolutionary question we can ask isn't about what new innovations we need to develop. Perhaps the question is, are we humble enough to learn from those we once called primitive? The thermal wisdom of our ancestors offers more than historical curiosity. It offers a roadmap to a sustainable future that doesn't require sacrifice or hardship, just the rediscovery of intelligence we once possessed, and somehow convinced ourselves to abandon. The cave paintings aren't just art, they're blueprints. The ancient songs aren't just folklore, they're technical manuals. And the people who created them weren't primitive survivors scraping by in harsh conditions. They were the most sophisticated thermal engineers in human history. And we are their forgetful children, finally beginning to remember what we lost.